Good evening, afternoon, or morning, wherever you are in the world. My name is Ahiram. I'm a student of the Western mystery tradition, and the title of this presentation is An Overview of Gnosticism, and I've split it into 4 parts. Part 1 is history, Part 2 is mythology and structure, Part 3 is Gnostic initiations, and Part 4 is Gnosticism in modern times. So let's begin. The word Gnosticism comes from the Greek gnosis, meaning knowledge or having knowledge, and refers to awareness, experience, and knowledge of the presence of God. It also frequently refers to self-awareness, as one realizes and recognizes the divine spark within their mortal shell. Gnosticism is a modern term categorizing a collection of ancient religions whose adherents shunned the material world, which they viewed as created by a false god that they called the demiurge, and they embraced the spiritual world. Gnostic ideas influenced many ancient religions that teach that gnosis, that is, enlightenment, salvation, or oneness with God, may be reached by practicing philanthropy and diligently searching for wisdom by helping others. In Gnosticism, the world of the demiurge is represented by the underworld, which is associated with flesh, time, and more particularly, the imperfect and temporary world. The world of God, on the other hand, is represented by the upper world and is associated with the soul and perfection. The Gnostics considered the world of God to be eternal, impalpable, and timeless, and not part of the physical world. Gnosticism is primarily defined in a Christian context. In the past, some scholars thought that Gnosticism predated Christianity and included pre-Christian religious beliefs and spiritual practices argued to be common to early Neoplatonism, Hellenistic Judaism, Greco-Roman mystery religions, and Zoroastrianism. The discussion of Gnosticism changed radically with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in 1945, which led to a revision of older assumptions. To date, no pre-Christian Gnostic texts have been found. Okay, part 1, history. Before the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library, much of what we know today about Gnosticism was preserved only in the summaries and assessments of early church fathers. The Nag Hammadi library is a collection of Gnostic texts discovered in 1945 near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. They were discovered by a local farmer who found 12 leather-bound papyrus codices buried in a sealed jar. The writings in these codices comprised 52 mostly Gnostic treatises. They also include 3 works belonging to the Corpus Hermeticum and a partial translation of Plato's Republic. Author James Robinson, in his introduction to the Nag Hammadi library, suggests that these codices may have belonged to a nearby Pachomian monastery and were buried after Bishop Athanasius condemned the use of non-canonical books in 367 AD. Some sources claim that there were numerous different groups of Gnostics during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, when Gnosticism reached its prime and thrived all throughout the Mediterranean world. However, there seems to have been 2 main Gnostic groups within the Christianity of the period, and these may have been the only ones around at the time. The first of these groups is the classic Gnostics, which were the original group of Gnostics in antiquity. The classic Gnostics are sometimes called Sethians, based on the spiritual and mythological importance they ascribed to Seth, the 3rd son of Adam and Eve in Genesis. The classic Gnostics seem to have worshipped only with other classic Gnostics and to have lived rigorously ascetic lifestyles. The second main Gnostic group of the period was the Valentinians, who adopted much of the classic version of Gnosticism, but were different in their approach. For instance, they worshipped alongside other kinds of Christians and then held their own separate meetings afterwards, which made them more socially integrated into the Christian mainstream than the classic Gnostics. The Valentinians could marry, have children, and generally partake in worldly life, even while striving to remain detached from it internally. This also made them better integrated socially than the classic Gnostics. Whereas the classic Gnostics often criticized other kinds of Christians in their texts, the Valentinians were much more theologically accommodating toward other Christian groups and expressed a desire for harmony and love between all Christians. Gnostic thought had a profound impact on the development of Christianity, which traditionally sees a struggle between an imperfect material world and a perfect spiritual world. However, early church fathers rejected Gnosticism as being compatible with Christianity, and when the Bible was compiled, they rejected the books containing the most Gnostic ideas. Various Gnostic groups have emerged within the Christian community throughout history, only to be branded heretical by Orthodox authorities. The most famous are the Cathars, whom the Albigensian Crusade was called against in 1209. Manichaeism, the faith of Saint Augustine before he converted, was also Gnostic, and Augustine's writings emphasized the struggle between the spiritual and the material. During the Middle Ages, three Gnostic groups emerged, which were the Paulicians, Bogomils, and Cathars, all of which were violently destroyed by the official church. The Paulicians were an adaptionist group of which little is known firsthand. They were accused by Orthodox medieval sources of being Gnostic and quasi-Manichaean Christian. They flourished between 650 and 872 AD in Armenia and the eastern themes of the Byzantine Empire. The Bogomils were the synthesis of Armenian Paulicianism and the Bulgarian Orthodox Church Reform movement, which emerged in Bulgaria between 927 and 970 AD and spread throughout Europe. The Cathars were a Gnostic revival movement that thrived in some areas of southern Europe, particularly northern Italy and southern France, between the 12th and 14th centuries. The Cathars are now mainly remembered for a period of persecution by the Catholic Church which did not recognize their belief as truly Christian. They appeared in Europe in the Languedoc region of France in the 11th century, and this is when the name Cathar first appears. Their beliefs are believed to have been brought from Persia or the Byzantine Empire. Gnosticism's precise origins are not known. However, the idea that Gnosticism was derived from Buddhism was first proposed by the Victorian gem collector Charles William King in 1864. From the 3rd century to the 12th century, some Gnostic religions such as Manichaeism, which combined Christian, Hebrew and Buddhist influences, spread throughout the Old World to Gaul and Great Britain in the west and to China in the east. Gnostics borrow a great deal of ideas and terms from Platonism. They exhibit a keen understanding of Greek philosophical terms and use Greek philosophical concepts throughout their text, including the concept of the demiurge. Although some scholars hypothesize that Gnosticism developed before or simultaneously with Christianity, no Gnostic texts have been discovered that predate Christianity. Since pre-Christian Gnosticism is hypothetical, any influence of Gnosticism upon Christianity is speculative. Essential Gnostic beliefs that differ from Orthodox Christian teachings include the Creator as a lower being, or demiurge, and not a supreme deity, The belief that all matter is evil or adverse, and the body is a prison to escape from, as opposed to the Nicene Creed teaching that there will be a physical resurrection, and Scripture having a deep hidden meaning whose true message could only be understood through secret wisdom. Many core Gnostic ideas appear also in Kabbalah. The Kabbalists emerged in 12th to 13th century Provence in southern France, which was at the time also the centre of the Gnostic Cathars. Some scholars in the middle of the 20th century have assumed an influence between the Cathar Gnostics and the origins of the Kabbalah. On the other hand, other scholars have hypothesized that there was originally a Jewish Gnosticism which influenced the early origins of Gnosticism. Kabbalah does not employ the terminology or labels of Gnosticism, but grounds similar concepts in the language of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Okay, part 2, Mythology and Structure. The basic Gnostic myth has many variations, but all of these refer to aeons, intermediate deific beings who exist between the ultimate true God and ourselves. They, together with the true God, comprise the realm of fullness, or the pleroma, in which the potency of divinity operates fully. The fullness, or pleroma, stands in contrast to our existential state, which in comparison may be called emptiness. The true unknowable God was referred to as the Bythos, or the One. From this initial beginning, the Bythos spontaneously emanated further aeons, being pairs of progressively lesser beings in sequence. The transition from the immaterial to the material is brought about by a flaw or error in one of the aeons. In most versions of the Gnostic mythos, it is Sophia who brings about this instability in the pleroma, in turn bringing about the creation of materiality. According to some Gnostic texts, this crisis occurs as a result of Sophia, an aeon, trying to breach the barrier between herself and the unknowable Bythos. After cataclysmically falling from the pleroma, Sophia's fear and anguish of losing her life causes confusion and longing to return to it. Because of these longings, matter accidentally comes into existence. The creation of the demiurge is also a mistake made during this exile. The demiurge is a false god who proceeds to create the physical world in which we live, ignorant of Sophia, who, nevertheless, manages to infuse some spiritual spark into the demiurge's creation. The demiurge, or creator god, is considered by Gnostics to be a lesser and inferior or false god. In most Gnostic systems, this demiurge was seen as imperfect, in others as evil. Different Gnostic schools sometimes identified the demiurge as Ahriman, El, Saklas, Samael, Satan, Yaldabaoth, or Yahweh. The demiurge typically creates a group of co-actors named archons who preside over the material realm and, in some cases, present obstacles to the soul seeking ascent from it. In the words of the Gnostic texts, the Gospel of Philip, quote, "The world came into being through a mistake," end quote. And so the human condition, as we know it today, came about not through the actions of Adam and Eve, but rather through a fall that had already occurred in heaven prior to the creation of the world. and this is how the demiurge is often depicted. So who or what are the archons then? The visionary artist Lawrence Caruana describes how various archons relate to the 7 planets and 5 elements. In the left-hand column of the table, there is a list of archons, and in the right-hand column are their corresponding planets and elements. Now, the task of the practitioner of the Western mystery tradition is to master the elements and planets in sequence in order to ascend beyond their influence over the practitioner. So, if we consider what we said earlier, that in the Gnostic tradition, the archons preside over the material realm and present obstacles to the soul seeking ascent. Well, that perfectly describes the situation regards to the elements and planets upon an individual who has not yet mastered their influences. So it would appear then that the Gnostics were approaching the same magical undertaking, but from their own unique perspective. According to the Gnostic text, the Pistis Sophia, Christ is sent from the Godhead in order to bring Sophia back into the Pleroma. Christ enables her to again see the light, bringing her knowledge of the Spirit. Christ is then sent to earth in the form of the man Jesus to give people gnosis needed to free them from the physical world and return to the spiritual world. In Gnosticism, the gospel story of Jesus is itself allegorical. That is to say, it is the outer mystery, used as an introduction to gnosis, rather than being literally true in a historical context. For the Gnostics, the drama of the redemption of the Sophia through Christ, or the Logos, is the central drama of the universe. Sophia resides in all of us as the divine spark. And on the screen there is an artist's impression of Sophia. Christ, the Son of the true God, came to earth to liberate the sparks of divinity trapped within the clutches of the demiurge and the archons. He took over the body of a man named Jesus and taught people how to achieve gnosis, the awareness of who and what they really are, which would save them from the conditions in which they were trapped. In the Gnostic view, humans are generally ignorant of the divine spark resident within them. This ignorance is fostered in human nature by the influence of the false creator and his archons, who together are intent upon keeping men and women ignorant of their true nature and destiny. Anything that causes us to remain attached to earthly things serves to keep us in enslavement to these lower cosmic rulers. The term pneumatic was used to describe individuals who were spiritual, ready for gnosis and liberation. The term hylic was used to describe materialistic people who recognize only the physical reality. Others live largely in their psyche and were termed psychics. Psychics usually mistake the demiurge for the true God and have little or no awareness of the spiritual world beyond matter and mind. Dualism is a significant theme in the Gnostic mythology. Dualism, roughly speaking, posits the existence of 2 creators. The first is a god of goodness and pure spirituality, i.e. the Bythos, while the second, the demiurge, is the creator of the physical world, which has trapped divine souls in mortal form. In some cases, the demiurge is considered a god in and of itself, equal and opposite to the Godhead. In other cases, the demiurge is a being of lesser, although still considerable, standing. The demiurge might be a specifically evil being, or it might simply be imperfect, just as its creation is imperfect. In both cases, Gnostics worship only the Bythos, as the demiurge is not worthy of such reverence. Some Gnostics were highly ascetic, rejecting the material world as strongly as possible. This is not the approach of all Gnostics, although all are ultimately spiritually focused on gaining an understanding of and unification with the Bythos, i.e. the true God. Additionally, general Gnostic thought commonly includes the belief that the material world corresponds to some sort of malevolent intoxication brought about by the powers of darkness to keep elements of the light trapped inside it, or literally to keep them in the dark or ignorant in a state of drunken distraction. The spiritual world is conceived of as being radically different from the material world, coextensive with the true God, and the true home of certain enlightened members of humanity. Thus, these Gnostic systems were expressive of a feeling of acute alienation within the world, and their resultant aim was to allow the soul to escape the constraints presented by the physical realm. Okay, part 3, Gnostic initiations. The initiations of the Gnostics were primarily centered on the classical elements and the 7 planets recognized in antiquity, and they usually involved various baptismal rites and the conferral of passwords at each stage of initiation. It was believed that the 4 classical elements of antiquity, earth, water, air, and fire, represented stages of consciousness illumination, with earth representing the consciousness obsessed with the passions and enslaved by matter on one extreme, and fire representing the consciousness free to shine with the light of God on the other extreme. The initiates therefore learned to master their emotions with the initiation associated by the baptism by water, the intellect with the initiation associated with air, and spiritual understanding with the initiation associated with fire. The lower false self, called the eidolon, or the twin, symbolically died, and the higher self, called the daemon, spelt D-A-E-M-O-N, was free to express itself in mastery as a reflection of God. God was therefore represented as the supreme light, and in fact, the Gnostics were often called the Sons of Light, or sometimes the Religion of Light. The first type of personality was represented by Earth and involved people whose consciousness were totally obsessed with the physical world, the physical senses, and their own ego. These personalities, as we pointed out earlier, were referred to as hylics, and the early Gnostics taught that they identified with a false physical body called the eidolon or twin. In biblical terminology referred to these people as blind or dead or asleep, since they couldn't perceive the spiritual root of all things and didn't understand that their true body was spiritual and not physical. Initiatic fraternities would refer to them as profane or uninitiated. Once a person had an experience of the divine nature of the world, however, they underwent a change of heart, so to speak, and had achieved the witnessing of some light. Most English translations of the Bible refer to this change of heart as repentance, though the Greek word associated with it is metanoia. Metanoia did not mean that you need to confess to a priest or apologize to God, but rather that you simply changed your heart and your focus towards attempting to understand your connection with God, and you are therefore free in the truest sense. It is the first step in spiritual awakening. The next Gnostic initiation was usually done with air or breath and was called pneumatic. A pneumatic initiate came to understand their nature in impersonal terms and God as the One, the fullness, the pleroma. Duality begins to become understood and then transcended, and all relationships with God begin to be brought into oneness. The pneumatic initiates also came to understand that if God was a point within a circle, and the outer circumference of the circle represented the physical form, and the lines of radius emanating from the point in the centre of the circle represented various stages of consciousness and various personas of the One. In the outer circumference of the circle, each radius appeared as unique and distinct, but at the source of all was God, the mystery of the mysteries. The point within the circle in ancient symbolism symbolized gold and the sun. Getting to the center of the circle was the path of gnosis. Fire represented the initiation into gnosis. At some point in the Gnostic pneumatic process, attachment to the false self or eidolon or twin had to symbolically die so that the new higher spiritual body could awaken. This awakening was the Gnosis, and to the Christian Gnostics it was represented by Christ, which was a state of realization of the universal consciousness that transcends time and place. The Christ was the point within the circle that the Gnostics were attempting to reach. Ultimately, the goal of the Gnostic tradition was a level of mastery, which was represented by light. Gnosticism teaches that mastery comes from understanding the spiritual forces behind creation and matter. Okay, part 4, Gnosticism in modern times. Throughout the 20th century, the new scientific discipline of depth psychology has gained a great deal of prominence. Carl Gustav Jung pictured a depth psychologist who had a pronounced interest in Gnosticism, was instrumental in calling attention to the Nag Hammadi library of Gnostic writings in the 1950s due to the outstanding psychological relevance of Gnostic insights. The Gnostic scholar Giovanni Filoramo wrote, quote, Jung's reflections had long been immersed in the thought of the ancient Gnostics to such an extent that he considered them the virtual discoverers of depth psychology. Ancient Gnostics, or ancient Gnosis rather, albeit in its form of universal religion, in a certain sense prefigured and at the same time helped to clarify the nature of Jungian spiritual therapy. End quote. So, given these recognitions, it may be asked, is Gnosticism a religion or a psychology? Well, the answer may actually be both. For instance, the demiurge, the blind and arrogant false creator god, bears a close resemblance to the alienated human ego that has lost contact with the ontological self. Also, the myth of Sophia closely resembles the story of the human psyche that loses its connection with the collective unconscious and needs to be rescued by the self. There are many analogies of this sort. Our psychological nature, the microcosm, mirrors metaphysical nature, the macrocosm, as above, so below. Thus, Gnosticism may possess both a psychological and a religious authenticity. Gnostic psychology and Gnostic religion need not be exclusive of one another, may complement each other within an implicit order of wholeness. Gnostics have always held that divinity is immanent within the human spirit, although it is not limited to it. The convergence of Gnostic religious teaching with psychological insight is therefore understandable in terms of time-honored Gnostic principles. A number of 19th century thinkers, such as Arthur Schopenhauer, Albert Pike, and Madame Blavatsky, studied Gnostic thought extensively and were influenced by it. And even figures like Herman Melville and W.B. Yeats were influenced. Jules Dornoel re-established a Gnostic church in France in 1890, which altered its form as it passed through various direct successors and, though small, is still active today. In addition to Carl Jung, other early 20th century thinkers who heavily studied and were influenced by Gnosticism include political philosopher Eric Voegelin, writer Georges-Louis Borges, who included Gnosticism in many of his short stories, Aleister Crowley, who composed a Gnostic Mass, and figures such as the novelist Hermann Hesse, being more moderately influenced. René Guénon founded the Gnostic review Le Nos, a periodical, in 1909. Gnostic Thelemite organizations such as Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica and Ordo Templi Orientis trace themselves to Aleister Crowley's thoughts. The discovery and translation of the Nag Hammadi library after 1945 has had a huge effect on Gnosticism since World War II. Intellectuals who were heavily influenced by Gnosticism in this period include novelist and poet Lawrence Durrell, philosopher Hans Jonas, science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, and literary critic Harold Bloom, with Albert Camus and Allen Ginsberg being more moderately influenced. A number of ecclesiastical bodies that think of themselves as Gnostic have set up or refounded since World War II, including the Society of Novus Spiritus, Ecclesia Gnostica, Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica, the Thomasine Church, the Apostolic Johannite Church, the Alexandrian Gnostic Church, and the North American College of Gnostic Bishops. So just to recap then, we looked into the history of Gnosticism from the emergence of the classic Gnostics in the 2nd and 3rd centuries to the Cathars in the 11th to the 14th centuries and the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library. We looked into the mythology and the creation myth of the Gnostics. We then looked at some of the Gnostic initiations, and finally we touched upon the influence of Gnosticism from the 1800s to the present day. So that concludes an overview of Gnosticism. Thank you for listening, and I hope you got something from it.
Thank you very much, Ahiram. We have our microphone over there. Feel free to line up behind it if you have any questions. I guess I'll get started with a quick one. Do you know of any monuments or buildings or things like that that were left behind by any of the currents that you mentioned of Gnosticism?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I do know that there are some old artifacts in the Languedoc region of France. That was an area inhabited by the Cathars. Whether those artifacts and buildings and remains have anything to do with or were created by Gnostics is unclear, because it has a very interesting history, and there were other groups operating in that area, throughout different times in history, including the Knights Templar, in fact. So, I mean, that's an area where there may be some kind of buildings or remains from the Gnostics, but I'm not 100% on that. There may be some evidence of the Bogomils in Bulgaria as well, but that's something. It's a really good question. I'll have to look a bit further into that to find out.
Do you know if the Gnostics think of the Bythos as like having separate agency, sort of how like the Christians generally treat their perspective of God, or is it more like pantheistic?
I think um, I think the best way to describe it is that the Bythos is considered to contain within it, everything in creation. However, the physical world has become detached from it and forgotten it. And the idea of the Gnostic was to remember their connection with the Bythos and therefore become one with it, right? So any detachment from it or separation from it is actually an error or a misunderstanding, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Okay, and then one other thing I was kind of wondering, a lot of these like organizations that seem to um, take a lot of influence from Gnosticism, from my experience, seem to have a lot of focus on self-practice and self-learning. Do you think that's a kind of a consequence of modern times, or maybe Gnostic philosophy has always been that way?
Um, it's possible that Gnostic philosophy has been inclined that way ever since the beginning, in the sense that there is an emphasis on self-responsibility, right? And striving to become the best you can be without rather than just following what you're told to do, right? Yes, there's a framework and a structure, right? But that's essentially a guide to your own development, right? So it's possible. I would suggest that it there has been an emphasis on individual development throughout the history of Gnosticism.
Awesome. Okay. And then my last question, there's some 21st century references to Gnosticism. I feel like the Matrix is a pretty good example of that, but is there any others that you could think of or would want to mention?
Well, um, I've heard many different ideas which have been associated and attributed to Gnosticism, um, but they do kind of deviate somewhat from um, the, the 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 theme of Gnostic, the traditional Gnostic theme when it's studied, right, in its core kind of raw form, right. However, what I would say is that there are many parallels between the Gnostic idea and other um, schools of thought, right? So, for instance, the parallel between Gnosticism and depth psychology, which is a relatively new profession, right? And so, different worldviews and different ways of perceiving the world, if there's any validity to them at all, are likely to have some parallels, right? But that doesn't mean to say that the Gnostics were specifically talking about modern worldviews, right? I would suggest that that there are parallels, but that I think some certain ideas should not be attributed to Gnosticism, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's all I got. Thank you, Aaron.
As you mentioned, the demiurge is the creator of this physical reality. And I was wondering, what is the correlation between the demiurge terminology and the ego, as we see that the ego thinks, because it's unaware of the creation. So the ego, when it starts to grow, it thinks that it's the center of everything. And thus, it is also said that the demiurge doesn't know the God behind it. It thinks that it's the center of everything or the beginning of everything. of this. And so there can be some kind of correlation between those. And I was wondering, when we say that the physical world is made by demiurges, do we actually, when the ego is constructing in humans, also creates the perception of the world? So without the truth, it creates the world which is not aligned with the real truth.
The demiurge, right, which is the blind and arrogant false creator god, right, in the Gnostic tradition, bears a close resemblance to the alienated human ego that has lost contact with the ontological self, right? Given that resemblance, an isolated ego would, not knowing that there is a true self, kind of seeks to control things, take the helm, so to speak.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please share it and subscribe to the channel. Become a supporter to help create more VR and multimedia content at vrmystery.school/support. Join the Discord chat with invite code VRM, or learn how to join our events in virtual reality at vrmystery.school/join. No headset required.